Success is a fortress. You build it brick by brick with ruthless deals, sleepless nights, and a calculated distance from everyone you meet. My name is Julian Thorne, and by the age of 45, I had built the most impenetrable fortress of all. My net worth was a number so large it had ceased to have meaning, a digital ghost in the banking system. I lived in a penthouse that occupied the top 3 floors of the city's tallest skyscraper. The walls were glass, offering a dizzying, godlike view of the world I ostensibly owned. Below me, the city was a circuit board of lights and ambition, a machine I understood how to operate. But a fortress, by its very nature, is also a cage. The silence was the first thing you noticed. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a deep, vacuum-sealed hush, engineered by soundproofing that cost more than most houses. There was no hum of life, no distant traffic, no muffled voices from another room. Just the sterile, conditioned air and the occasional, almost imperceptible whisper of the climate control system. I was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. There was Charles, my unflappable butler, whose professionalism was a wall as solid as my own. There were security details who changed shifts with silent, military precision. And there was a rotation of domestic staff, cleaners, cooks, who were little more than ghosts in crisp uniforms, appearing and vanishing without a trace, leaving only the evidence of their work. Spotless surfaces and perfectly arranged flowers. The newest ghost was the maid, Alara. She'd been with me for 3 months, hired by Charles after a rigorous vetting process. She was in her late 50s, I guessed, with a quiet, unassuming demeanor and hands that looked like they had known real work. She was a silhouette, a silent function in the machinery of my life. I knew nothing about her, and I had no desire to. In my world, people were variables in an equation, their value defined by their utility and their potential for risk. Loneliness is a luxury of the poor. The rich don't get lonely, we get suspicious. We are conditioned to believe that every smile has a price tag. Every kind word is a prelude to a request. Affection is a transaction. I hadn't had a conversation that wasn't about business, strategy, or logistics in a decade. My ex-wives have been paid off with settlements that could fund small nations, their love for me neatly quantified and settled. My children were at boarding schools in Switzerland, polished products of a system I paid for. Their weekly video calls a checklist of academic achievements and requests for increased allowances. I sat in my favorite chair, a monstrously expensive piece of minimalist art that was profoundly uncomfortable, and stared at the sunset painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. I felt nothing. The beauty was a fact, like a stock price. It held no joy. My gaze fell on a faint, almost invisible smudge on the glass coffee table. An imperfection. Alara's work was usually flawless. A minor irritation flickered within me. Was she getting complacent? Was she, like so many before her, beginning to think she could cut corners because the master of the house was too distracted by his empires to notice? Paranoia, the constant companion of great wealth, began to whisper. What did she really do when she thought no one was watching? Did she snoop? Did she cut corners? Did she talk about me to the others? My life was a vault of secrets, financial blueprints, merger plans, personal weaknesses. The idea of a stranger, this silent, unknown woman, having unrestricted access to the inner sanctum of my life suddenly felt like a catastrophic security breach. I couldn't ask Charles. He would give me a perfectly rational, reassuring answer. I couldn't review the security footage that felt too overt, too much like the paranoid billionaire I was but refused to openly acknowledge. No, I needed to see for myself. I needed to observe the ghost when it thought it was alone. An idea, cold and calculating, formed in my mind. It was a test, a simple, elegant way to assess the variable in my equation. I would be in the room, but I would be absent. I would create a scenario of vulnerability and observe how she operated. The next afternoon, I went to my private study, a room lined with first editions I never read. I dismissed Charles, telling him I had a migraine and was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. I sat in a deep leather armchair by the window, positioned my body in a way that looked naturally asleep, and closed my eyes. I left the door slightly ajar. A calculated risk. Then I waited. I regulated my breathing, making it slow and deep. The city hummed, a distant, muted thrum beyond the thick glass. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. My leg began to cramp, but I didn't move. This was an investment. Due diligence. And then I heard it. The soft, almost silent turn of the door handle. The whisper of the door swinging open on perfectly oiled hinges. The gentle pad of footsteps on the Persian rug. Alara was in the room. I remained perfectly still, my breathing even, playing my part flawlessly. This was the moment of truth. I was no longer Julian Thorne, billionaire. I was a piece of furniture, a test subject. And I was about to see what the ghost would do when it thought the master was asleep. The human body is not designed for absolute stillness. After the first 10 minutes, a deep ache began to radiate from my lower back. A rogue muscle in my thigh twitched, a frantic, involuntary pulse that screamed for movement. I focused on my breathing, making each inhalation and exhalation a slow, deliberate performance. In, out, steady, rhythmic. The heartbeat in my ears was a frantic drum, but I trusted the room's acoustics and the thickness of the rug to swallow the sound. Her footsteps were feather-light, the careful, practiced steps of someone who existed to be unnoticed. I could feel her presence in the room, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a change in the quality of the silence. She wasn't moving towards the desk, with its confidential papers and sleek, encrypted laptops. That was my first small data point. Relief, cold and clinical, registered. So, she wasn't a corporate spy. A low-level thief, then? My watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than her annual salary 100 times over, was on the wrist dangling off the armrest. An easy, tempting target. I braced for it, for the faint tug on the strap, the brush of fingers against my skin. It didn't come. Instead, her movements continued in a slow, methodical pattern around the periphery of the room. I heard the soft, dry whisper of a feathered duster gliding across the spines of the books I never read. The gentle clink as she straightened a bronze statue on the mantelpiece. The barely there rustle of the velvet curtains as she checked their alignment. This was mundane. Disappointingly so. It was exactly what she was supposed to be doing. A part of me, the part that thrived on confirmation of my own cynical worldview, felt a flicker of irritation. Perhaps she was just very, very good at her job. Perhaps the smudge on the table had been a true anomaly. I was about to call the whole experiment off, to wake up and dismiss her with a grunt, when her footsteps changed direction. They moved away from the bookshelves, away from the desk. They came towards me. My internal alarms, finely tuned by a lifetime of boardroom, coups, and hostile takeovers, blared silently. This was it, the moment of truth. Was she coming for the watch? A wallet? Was she simply going to stand and stare at the sleeping billionaire, a grotesque tourist in my private zoo? The footsteps stopped. She was standing right beside my chair. I could smell a faint, clean scent. Not perfume, but simple, unscented soap in the crisp starch of her uniform. I felt the warmth of her body, a small pocket of heat in the room's sterile climate. My every instinct was screaming to open my eyes, to confront the intrusion, to re-establish the vast, unbreachable distance between us. But I didn't. I played my part. I expected a touch, a probing, greedy hand. What I did not expect was the sound of fabric, a soft, rustling sigh. Then a sudden, blessed weight settled over me. A wave of warmth enveloped my body, driving away the slight chill from the window I hadn't even registered. She had draped a blanket over me. The sensation was so foreign, so utterly disconnected from any script I had written for this encounter, that my carefully regulated breath hitched for a fraction of a second. I prayed she hadn't noticed. My mind, a supercomputer built for parsing complex financial instruments and geopolitical risk, scrambled to process this simple action. It didn't compute. It was an illogical variable, a move with no strategic value. This wasn't in her job description. Charles handled my personal comforts. The maids cleaned. Their functions were separate, their boundaries clear. This was a transgression, but not the kind I had anticipated. It was a transgression of kindness. Why? What was the angle? Was it a calculated move to garner favor? A sycophantic gesture from an employee trying to curry favor with her powerful boss? It felt too gentle for that. There had been no hesitation, no performative sigh of concern. It had been a quiet, efficient motion. I lay there, trapped beneath the weight of the blanket and the weight of my own confusion. The game had changed. The simple test of honesty had become something more complex, something I had no framework for understanding. The ghost in my house had not tried to steal from me. She had, for reasons I could not fathom, shown me a minute fleeting care. And in doing so, she had completely and utterly stunned me. The weight of the blanket was an anchor, pinning me to the chair and to the bewildering reality of the moment. The soft, cashmere wool, a material I owned but never truly felt, seemed to radiate a warmth that seeped through my skin into muscles perpetually coiled with tension. It was a simple act, a gesture my own mother might have made a lifetime ago. But from a paid employee in the heart of my fortified domain, it felt like a seismic event. My mind, a vault of strategies and contingencies, whirred uselessly. There was no column in my mental ledger for unprompted kindness. I categorized it as a variable, an anomaly, but it refused to be neatly filed away. The initial, cold curiosity that had started this charade was now laced with a deeper, more compelling need to understand. The test was no longer about her honesty. It was about her motive. So I kept my eyes closed. I became a statue, a silent witness. The pretense of sleep was no longer a tactic. It was a shield protecting me from the disarming vulnerability of the moment. To open my eyes now would be to break the spell, to reassert the dynamic of master and servant. And a treacherous part of me, a part one had starved into submission for years, did not want that. It wanted to see what would happen next in this strange, quiet play where I was an audience of one. She did not leave. I heard her move away, back to her work. The soft whisk of the duster, the careful placement of an object on a shelf. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of her small, illogical act. I was hyper-aware of her presence, of every rustle and footfall. Minutes passed. My body had acclimated to its forced stillness, the initial discomfort replaced by a strange, detached calm. The city below was a silent, glittering tapestry. The only sound was Alara's quiet industry and the rhythm of my own breath. Then she began to hum. It was so faint, so tentative, that at first I thought it was a trick of the ventilation system. A low, melodic thread of sound, weaving through the silence. It was a simple tune, something folk-like and old, devoid of the aggressive bass lines or operatic pretensions of the music played at my charity galas. It was the kind of music that belonged in a kitchen with the smell of baking bread, or in a garden with hands deep in the soil. The humming was unconscious, I was sure of it. It was the sound of a mind at peace with its task, a soul content in its own company. In my world, people made noise for effect, to command a room, to project power, to fill an awkward silence. This was different. This was a private sound, one I was never meant to hear. She moved around the room, and the gentle melody moved with her, a quiet soundtrack to her work. She dusted the picture frames, photographs of my children, frozen in time and smiling for the camera. She straightened the stack of financial journals on the side table, their headlines screaming about markets and mergers. She did all of this to the soft, unassuming rhythm of her hum. And as I listened, something broke inside me. Not dramatically, but quietly, like a single strand of glass stressed beyond its limit. This woman, this ghost, was not a variable. She was a person who hummed while she worked. A person who, upon seeing a man she believed to be asleep in a cold, sterile room, had thought to bring him warmth. In that moment, the blanket was no longer just a blanket. It was a question, a challenge to the very foundation of my existence. I had spent a lifetime building walls, equating value with wealth and power with distance. I had surrounded myself with the most expensive things the world had to offer, yet a simple, unasked-for gesture of care from a maid had somehow, impossibly, become the most valuable thing in the room. The humming stopped as she finished her tasks. I heard her footsteps approach once more. She paused beside my chair, and I felt a fresh, jangling spike of adrenaline. Was this the moment the act dropped? Was she looking at my watch now? But there was only a soft, sighing silence. Then the faintest adjustment of the blanket over my shoulders. A gentle tuck, a final, unspoken confirmation of her intent. Her footsteps receded. The door whispered shut. The lock clicked softly into place. I was alone again, but the silence was different. It was no longer a void. It was filled with the memory of a hum and the lingering, impossible warmth of a kindness that asked for nothing in return. I slowly opened my eyes, staring out at the indifferent city. The game was over, and I had lost. I had set out to test her integrity and had instead been confronted with the profound poverty of my own. The blanket remained. I sat there for a long time, long after the door had closed, staring at the intricate weave of the cashmere. It was a deep, charcoal gray, one of a dozen identical blankets stored in a linen closet Charles maintained with military precision. But this one was different. It had been placed. It was now an artifact, a testament to an event my wealth could not explain. A strange paralysis held me. The cynical part of my brain, the CEO, fought for control. She's clever. This is a long con. She's building trust to exploit later. But the CEO was losing his voice. The memory of that unconscious, peaceful humming was a more powerful argument than any boardroom logic. I had to know more. The next day, I did not pretend to sleep. I became a ghost in my own home, a silent observer haunting the periphery of Alara's world. I used the penthouse's layout, the split levels, the soundproofed walls, the strategic sight lines, to my advantage. I was conducting surveillance on a single, unarmed subject within my own domain. What I saw over the next week dismantled my understanding of her, piece by piece. It started in the kitchen. I watched from the dining alcove, hidden by a half-wall, as she prepared my morning coffee. Charles always brought it to me, perfectly timed, in a bone china cup. But before the pot was even finished brewing, I saw Alara take a small thermos from her bag. She poured the first, rich stream of coffee into it, sealed it, and placed it carefully back into her bag. Then, she proceeded to make the pot for me. She was stealing my coffee. The revelation was so absurd, I almost laughed aloud. Not the watch, not the silver, but coffee. But the act itself wasn't furtive. It was ritualistic. It had the practiced ease of a daily habit. The following day, I observed her in the grand living room. She dusted the monstrously expensive modern art sculptures with a detached professionalism. But then she stopped in front of a small, unremarkable landscape painting I had acquired in a bulk lot from a bankrupt collector. It was worth very little. She stood there for a full minute, just looking at it. Her posture changed. The starch seemed to go out of her uniform. She reached out and, with a tenderness that was startling, traced the frame with her dusting cloth, as if polishing a cherished heirloom. Later, I saw her in the conservatory, watering the exotic orchids that were tended to by a specialized botanist. She did nothing to the plants themselves. But on the windowsill, hidden behind a large fern, was a small, terracotta pot with a single, struggling succulent she had apparently brought from home. She poured a little water from her bottle into that pot, whispering something too low for me to hear. These were not the actions of a thief or sycophant. They were the rituals of a person trying to carve out small islands of humanity in a sea of cold opulence. She was taking a cup of comfort, finding solace in a forgotten painting, nurturing a small piece of her own life she had smuggled into mine. The most profound observation came on Friday. I was in my study, the door opened a crack when I saw her cleaning the hallway. A shaft of morning sun fell across a particular spot on the Persian runner. Alara finished vacuuming, then did something extraordinary. She kicked off her plain, practical shoes. In her stockinged feet, she walked to the sunbeam, stood in the center of it, and closed her eyes. She lifted her face to the light, and for just 10 seconds, she stood there, utterly still, soaking in the warmth. A small, serene smile touched her lips. Then, She stepped out of the light, put her shoes back on, and continued her work as if nothing had happened. It was a stolen moment of pure, private joy, a communion with something as simple and free as sunlight. I retreated into my study, my heart pounding as if I'd witnessed a state secret. And in a way, I had. I had seen the secret to a richness that had nothing to do with my bank accounts. This woman, who I paid a pittance to clean my toilets, possessed a quiet wealth of spirit I could not comprehend. She knew how to find beauty in a forgotten painting, how to take a moment of peace in a sunbeam, how to offer a blanket to a man she thought was cold. My pretense of sleep had shown me her kindness, but my silent vigil had shown me her soul. She wasn't just honest, she was whole. And in the pristine, silent, gilded cage of my life, her unseen rituals were the most real things I had encountered in years. The scales of my judgment, once firmly weighted in my own favor, were now tipping, and the imbalance was terrifying. A week of observation had turned my world on its axis. The data was irrefutable, and it pointed to a single, staggering conclusion. Alara was not a function, but a person of profound and unassailable integrity. More than that, she possessed a quiet contentment that was, in my economy, a currency more valuable than any I had ever traded. I found myself in a strange, new position. I was in her debt. The blanket, the humming, the stolen sunbeam. These were loans of humanity I had no idea how to repay. My usual methods were useless. I couldn't write her a bonus check for acts of kindness. I couldn't promote her to head of compassion. The entire framework of my life, transaction, reward, incentive, was rendered obsolete. How do you pay back a gift you were never meant to receive? The answer, when it came, was not from a boardroom playbook, but from a memory of her small, personal rituals. The thermos of coffee, the struggling succulent, the 10 seconds in the sunbeam. I started small. The next morning, I was in the kitchen before Charles. It felt alien, this space of stainless steel and cold marble. I fumbled with the expensive Italian coffee machine, a piece of technology more complex than some of my first corporate acquisitions. When it finally sputtered to life, I didn't just make a pot. I filled her thermos first with the rich, dark brew, then prepared my own cup. I left the thermos on the counter where she always left her bag, a silent, reciprocal offering. Later that day, I called Charles into my study. "The conservatory," I said, trying to sound casually imperious. "The orchids are excessive. Have them removed. I want something simpler in there. Low maintenance." Charles, ever professional, merely nodded, though I saw the faintest flicker of confusion in his eyes. The orchids were a status symbol. The following day, a team arrived and removed the $1,000 plants. In their place, I had them install a long, simple wooden bench directly in the path of the morning sun. I said nothing to Alara, but the next Friday, from my hidden vantage point, I watched her. She came into the conservatory, saw the new bench, and stopped. She looked around, as if expecting a trick. Then, slowly she sat down. She didn't just stand for 10 seconds. She sat for a full 5 minutes, her face turned to the sun, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. The small, serene smile returned, and it lasted longer this time. It was my first successful investment in this new, unfamiliar market. The return was a glimpse of her peace. But the biggest test was yet to come. It arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a phone call I was not supposed to hear. I was in my study, the door ajar, when the landline in the kitchen rang. Alara answered, her voice hushed and respectful. "Mr. Thorne's residence." There was a pause. I heard her breath catch. "How much?" she whispered, the words strained with a panic I had never heard from her. Another pause. "No, please. You can't. He needs that medication." I will have it. I promise. Friday. I will have it by Friday." The call ended. I heard a soft, choked sob, quickly stifled. Then, the sound of her resuming her work, the rhythm of her movements, now heavy with a desperate, silent worry. A crisis. A need. This was a language I understood. This was a problem that could be solved with the old currency. My first instinct was triumphant, a predator sensing weakness. Now, the cynical voice whispered, "You have leverage. You can offer to pay, and she will be forever in your debt. But the thought immediately soured. To use her distress as a tool would be to poison the strange, fragile bridge that was forming between us. It would transform a potential act of grace into another cold transaction. I didn't want her indebted. I wanted to help. The word felt foreign and clumsy in my mind. I couldn't just give her the money. It would be too blatant, too humiliating for her. The power imbalance would crush the delicate understanding I felt we had. I needed a reason, a pretext, an idea formed, one so convoluted and unorthodox it was either brilliant or insane. I waited until she had left for the day. Then I summoned Charles. Charles, I began, leaning back in my chair as if bored. The Vermeer in the East Corridor. Yes, sir. It's a fake. Charles, for the first time in a decade of flawless service, was visibly stunned. Sir, it was authenticated by. I don't care what they said. I interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. I've had a private expert look at it. It's a brilliant forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. It's an embarrassment. I want it gone, but discreetly. I won't have the press laughing at me. I paused, letting the lie settle. I want you to handle it. Have it taken down, crated, and disposed of. Give it to one of the staff. The maid, Alara. Tell her it's a worthless reproduction, but the frame might have some value if she sells it for scrap. I want out of my sight by tomorrow. Charles stared at me, his face a masterpiece of controlled confusion. He knew the painting was authentic. He knew the entire story was a fabrication. But his loyalty or his understanding of the eccentricities of the ultra-wealthy won out. Of course, sir. Discreetly. The next morning, I watched from the balcony as two of my security team, under Charles's stoic supervision, carefully crated the small, exquisite painting, a genuine Vermeer worth over $20 million, and loaded it into a nondescript van. They were delivering a worthless reproduction to Alara. It was an absurd, reckless gamble. I was effectively laundering a fortune as an act of charity. If this ever got out, I would be a laughingstock. But as I stood there, I felt a strange, clean excitement I hadn't felt since my earliest, riskiest deals. This was a different kind of acquisition. I wasn't gaining an asset. I was liquidating a piece of my cold, curated world to fuel the warm, real one she inhabited. I had converted $20 million of old currency into a single, desperate act of new kindness. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like my money had actually been worth something. 3 days passed. The silence from Alara's corner of the world was deafening. I found myself unable to focus on the billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions that usually consumed my days. The numbers on the screen blurred into meaningless digits. My entire attention was fixed on a single, unquantifiable variable, the delivery of that crate. I had expected something, a call from Charles, informing me that she had fainted. A note of tearful, grateful thanks left on the kitchen counter. A visible change in her demeanor, a lightness, a relief in the desperate worry I'd heard in her voice. But there was nothing. She arrived each morning at the same time, performed her duties with the same quiet efficiency, and left. The only difference was a new, almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. My carefully constructed narrative began to crack. Had Charles not relayed my instructions correctly? Had the crate been lost? Had she, in her practicality, simply sold the worthless frame for a few $100s and used it to pay a fraction of her debt? The true masterpiece lost forever in a scrapyard? The thought was a physical pain. It wasn't the loss of the money. It was the failure of the gesture. My grand, secret act of charity had apparently vanished into the void, unacknowledged and ineffective. The frustration built into a quiet fury. I had broken my own most sacred rule. I had engaged in a transaction where I didn't control the outcome. I had ventured into the messy, unpredictable world of human emotion and found it utterly confounding. On the fourth day, I could stand it no longer. I cornered Charles in the pantry, a place we were never supposed to be at the same time. The painting, I said, my voice a low, tight wire. The Vermeer. It was delivered. Charles turned, his expression unreadable. It was, sir. To Ms. Alera's residence, as you instructed. And I prompted, the word sharp. And nothing, sir. She accepted it. She was quiet. She asked me to thank you for your generosity. Quiet. The word was a dagger. It wasn't the reaction of someone who had just been handed a life-changing fortune. It was the reaction of someone who had been given a burden. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place that Friday afternoon. Alera was cleaning my study. I was pretending to work, but my every sense was attuned to her. She moved to the bookshelf, dusting the few personal photographs I allowed in the room. There was one of my children, another of me receiving a corporate award. She dusted them with her usual detached care. Then she stopped. She was looking at a small, silver-framed picture on the lowest shelf when I rarely looked at myself. It was a photograph of my father, taken a year before he died. He was standing in front of his small, failing hardware store, a place he had poured his soul into until it bankrupted him. He was smiling, but his eyes held the same weary defeat I had seen in my own reflection for years. Alera reached out, and, with a tenderness that was now familiar, she straightened the frame. But she didn't move on. She stood there, her back to me, her head bowed. I saw her shoulders tremble once, a silent, suppressed sob. And then she spoke, her voice so low it was almost a whisper, meant for the photograph, for the ghost of my father, for anyone but me. He tries to buy his way out of the silence, she murmured. But some holes can't be filled with money. The air left my lungs. I felt as if I'd been struck. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. She knew. Somehow, this quiet, unassuming woman had seen through my entire, elaborate, multi-million-dollar charade. She hadn't seen a generous, eccentric benefactor. She had seen a lonely, broken man trying to use his wealth as a bandage for a wound he didn't understand. She had accepted the painting not as a gift, but as a cry for help. And it had saddened her. The portrait I had of myself, the shrewd, powerful, untouchable billionaire, shattered into a million pieces. In its place was the reflection she saw, a man in a gilded cage, so impoverished in spirit that he thought the solution to her problem, and perhaps to his own, was a transfer of funds. My grand gesture wasn't noble. It was pathetic. It was the only language I knew, and she had recognized its poverty. She finished straightening the frame and continued her work, leaving me alone with the devastating echo of her words. The Vermeer hadn't stunned her. My loneliness had, and in that moment, I was more exposed, more truly seen than I had ever been in my life. The ghost had turned, and with a single, whispered sentence, had seen straight through the master. The silence after she left the study was a physical presence, thick and accusatory. He tries to buy his way out of the silence. The words echoed, each repetition peeling back another layer of my carefully constructed identity. I wasn't a magnate. I wasn't a titan of industry. I was a lonely boy in a man's suit, rattling around in a cavern of my own creation, trying to fill the void with the only thing I had ever been taught had value: money. And she had seen it. This woman, who I paid to dust my furniture, had diagnosed the sickness at the core of my soul with a precision my teams of therapists and life coaches never had. The humiliation was a hot, searing wave, followed by a profound, bone-deep shame. I had thought I was being magnanimous, a secret benefactor. In reality, I had been a patient throwing cash at a doctor, demanding a cure for a disease I refused to name. The balance of power, which I had always believed was irrevocably tilted in my favor, had not just leveled, it had inverted. She held a power over me now that was more absolute than any financial leverage, the power of truth. She knew who I was. For 2 days, I was a ghost in my own penthouse. I avoided her, taking meals in my room, using back corridors. I couldn't bear the thought of her eyes on me, those calm, knowing eyes that had seen through the Vermeer and into the hollow man beneath. The gilded cage was no longer just a cage. It was a glass box, and she was the only one on the outside who could see in. My usual escapes were useless. A call to my broker to move millions felt like a child stacking blocks. A directive to my legal team to initiate a hostile takeover felt petty and meaningless. The game was over, and I had lost. The only move left was surrender. On the third day, I found myself standing in the kitchen. It was late afternoon, the time she usually finished polishing the silver before she left. I heard her quiet footsteps approaching. There was no time to hide. No more games. She entered, stopping short when she saw me. Her expression was, as always, politely neutral. But in her eyes, I saw it. A flicker of that same deep, unsettling pity I had seen when she looked at my father's photograph. "Alara," I said. My voice was rough and used. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her hands clasped in front of her apron. The distance between us, just a few feet of polished marble floor, felt like a chasm I had spent a lifetime digging. I had to cross it, not with money, not with a transaction, but with the only currency that seemed to hold any value in her world: honesty. The painting, I began, forcing myself to hold her gaze. The Vermeer, it wasn't a fake. I saw the slightest intake of her breath, but she said nothing. She just waited. "I heard your phone call," I continued, the confession feeling like a physical weight being lifted from my chest. "I heard the worry in your voice. I wanted to help. It was the only way I knew how. It was clumsy and arrogant. I see that now." I looked down at my hands, the hands that had signed documents worth thousands of times more than her annual salary, and they felt useless. "You were right. About the silence. And about me." The admission hung in the air. I had stripped myself of my armor, laid down my weapons. I was completely, utterly defenseless before her. For a long moment, she was silent. I expected a lecture, a well-deserved admonishment on the limits of wealth. But it didn't come. "His name is Matteo," she said softly, her voice filling the quiet kitchen. "My grandson. He has a rare immune deficiency. The medication, it's not covered. The painting," she paused, swallowing hard. "I took it to a man, a specialist. He told me what it was worth. I couldn't accept it, Mr. Thorne. It was too much. It wasn't a gift, it was a weight." She had refused it. She had looked a fortune in the face, a fortune that could have solved all her problems, and she had turned it down because she had seen the confused, desperate intention behind it. "What did you do?" I whispered, stunned. "I told the man it was not mine to sell," she said simply. "I have it in a safe place. It belongs to you." The integrity of it was so staggering, it almost brought me to my knees. In her position, I would have sold it without a second thought. She had held on to a $20 million masterpiece out of a principle I couldn't even comprehend. "Keep it," I said, the words rushing out. "Sell it. For Matteo." She shook her head, a sad, gentle smile on her lips. "No, you cannot buy your way into being a good man, Mr. Thorne. And I cannot buy my grandson's health with a painting that was given out of loneliness. It would poison the miracle." The balance of power was now clear. She was the teacher, and I was the student. She was the whole, and I was the broken. The billionaire was the pauper, and the maid was the one of immeasurable wealth. "Then what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What is the currency?" She looked at me for a long time, her gaze seeing every crack, every flaw, every lonely, empty room inside me. "Time," she said finally. "Attention. The willingness to be quiet and to listen. That is the currency, is the only one that ever matters." And with that, she picked up her polishing cloth, gave me a final, unreadable look, and walked away, leaving me standing alone in my multi-million-dollar kitchen, having just received the most expensive and valuable lesson of my life. Time. Attention. The willingness to be quiet and to listen. Her words became the new operating system for my life, and the transition was a violent, humbling crash. The first few days were agony. The silence of the penthouse was no longer a void to be filled with deals and distractions. It was a classroom, and I was a failing student. I tried to sit quietly, to just be, but my mind was a frantic, caged animal, scrambling for a spreadsheet to analyze, a contract to dissect. The impulse to do something to fix this existential problem with a financial instrument was a physical itch. I didn't give Alara the Vermeer. I had it quietly moved to a climate-controlled storage facility, its title transferred to a trust in her grandson's name. It was no longer a gift from me. It was a resource for his future, detached from the poison of my intentions. It was the last transaction of the old world. Then, I began the arduous work of learning the new currency. It started with a question. Not a directive, not a command. A genuine, awkward question. I found her in the conservatory, sitting on the bench in the sunbeam. I didn't hide. I walked in and stood a respectful distance away. Alara. She looked up, not with surprise, but with a quiet expectation. The succulent, I said, gesturing to the small terracotta pot. It seems to be struggling. What does it need? She looked from me to the plant, and back again. A long, assessing moment passed. Then she spoke, not as a maid to her employer, but as a gardener to a novice. It needs more light than it gets here, and the soil is wrong. It's too dense. It needs grit to let the roots breathe. The next day, a bag of special potting mix and a small bag of horticultural grit appeared on the bench. We repotted it together, our hands dirty, not saying a word. It was the most honest work I had done in years. That small, shared task became a crack in the dam. The questions became easier. I asked her about the tune she hummed. It was a lullaby from her childhood in a small village in Portugal, a place I couldn't find on any of my custom-made maps. I asked about Mateo. She showed me a photograph from her wallet, a bright-eyed boy with a shock of dark hair and a smile that could power a city. She spoke of his courage, his love of dinosaurs, the crushing weight of the medical bills. I didn't offer to pay them. I listened. For the first time, I truly listened to another human being. I heard the fear and the love in her voice, and I understood that my money was irrelevant to this conversation. It was a wall, not a bridge. I started making my own coffee in the morning. I pour a cup for her, and we'd stand in the kitchen for 5 minutes, not speaking or talking about the weather or the news. It was unbearably mundane. It was a miracle. The change seeped into the rest of my life. I call my children, not for a scheduled, perfunctory video call, but just to talk. My daughter, Sophia, was silent for a full 10 seconds after I asked, "How are you, really?" The question had startled her. We talked for an hour. I didn't offer advice. I just listened. I began to leave the penthouse, not for meetings, but to walk. I visited the small, struggling hardware store my father had owned, now a trendy coffee shop. I felt the ghost of his failure, but for the first time, I didn't see it as a shameful secret. It was just his story, a part of mine. One afternoon, I came back from one of these walks. Alara was folding laundry in the linen room. I stood in the doorway. "I'm selling the penthouse," I said. She didn't look up, just continued her methodical folding. "Where will you go?" "I don't know." I answered, and it was the truth. "Somewhere smaller, with a garden." She nodded, a small, satisfied gesture. "That sounds good." The day I moved out, the gilded cage stood empty. The silence that was finally just silence, no longer holding any power over me. My fortune was no longer measured in a digital bank balance. It was measured in the quiet understanding in Alara's eyes when she handed me a carefully wrapped packet of seeds from her succulent. It was in the new, tentative warmth in my daughter's voice. It was in the memory of my father's smile in that photograph, no longer a symbol of defeat, but a reminder of a man who had tried. I had set out to test a maid's honesty and had ended up on a journey that led to my own redemption. The billionaire had pretended to be asleep to check on his maid, and what he saw, a glimpse of a rich, unassailable humanity, had not just stunned him. It had shattered him, and from those pieces, a different man was built. The true fortune, I discovered, wasn't something you accumulated. It was something you built, connection by fragile, human connection in the quiet spaces between the noise. And it was the only wealth that truly mattered.